I'm Emma Enderby, Chief Curator at The Shed, and welcome to our series of talks that look to the legacy and the ideas of artist Howardena Pindell and her exhibition at The Shed, Rope, Fire, Water, curated by Adize Wilford. We are so grateful to be able to be open and continue our work supporting artists at this time. Our mission at The Shed is to produce and welcome innovative art and ideas across all forms of creativity, to build a shared understanding of our rapidly changing world and a more equitable society. I'd like to thank the Ford Foundation and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their generous support of this exhibition and our public programs. I would also like to thank the Howard Gilman Foundation for providing the Zoom platform that we will all be using for this evening's conversation.
My name is Adize Wilford, and I'm an assistant curator at the exhibition Howardena Pindell, Rope, Fire, Water, now on view at The Shed through this spring. Over her nearly 60-year career, Howardena Pindell has been a trailblazing artist, curator, and activist. The exhibition features her well-known, richly textured abstract paintings that critically engage with the politics and social issues of her time, while also demonstrating the healing power of art. The exhibition is centered on Pindell's new film, Rope, Fire, Water, the artist's first video work in 25 years. The conversation is part of an ongoing series of programs that contextualize and celebrate the way that artists, curators, educators, policymakers, and so many more have felt the deep impact of Pindell's inspiring career. Experts from a wide range of fields come together to explore the intersections of art and policy, culture and community. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and if it's safe for you to do so, we invite you to attend Howardena Pindell Rope, Fire, Water in person at The Shed, open until the spring of 2021. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I have to say, this is such a special conversation for me, joining women in this field who I deeply admire and respect, and having this conversation with Howardena. It's always a pleasure to speak to you when we have, or when we organize this exhibition. It was just such an honor. And so to be able to have you speak about your career and the field is just a really incredible opportunity. And I'm so glad that you're here with us this evening. Before we jump into the conversation, I'd like to introduce everyone and to read everyone's bios. So first, Howardena Pindell. Born in 1943, Howardena Pindell studied painting at Boston University and Yale University. She then worked for 12 years at the Museum of Modern Art as an exhibition assistant, an assistant curator in the Department of National and International Traveling Exhibitions, and finally as an associate curator and acting director in the Department of Prints and Illustrated Books. In 1979, she began teaching at the State University of New York, Stony Brook, where she is now a distinguished professor. In her work, Pindell often employs lengthy metaphorical processes of destruction and reconstruction, addressing social issues of homelessness, AIDS, war, genocide, sexism, xenophobia, and apartheid. Pindell's work has been featured in many landmark exhibitions and is in the permanent collections of major international museums. Most recently, Pindell's work was the subject of a retrospective, Howardena Pindell, What Remains to be Seen. Naima J. Keith is the Vice President of Education and Public Programs at LACMA. Within her role, she oversees all aspects and sets the vision for LACMA's innovative, exhibition-driven educational programming that serves more than 650,000 community members annually. Under her purview, LACMA has constructed strategic goals and launched initiatives to successfully pivot to virtual programming throughout the 2020 pandemic. Keith leads 20 staff members, freelance educators, interns, and a myriad of volunteer docents. Prior to her position at LACMA, Keith was the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the California African American Museum, where she guided curatorial and education departments, as well as marketing and communications. Previously, she was an associate curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem and held a curatorial position at the Hammer Museum. Keith holds degrees from Spelman College and UCLA and is a proud native of Los Angeles. Courtney J. Martin became the director of the Yale Center for British Art in 2019, a decade after earning a PhD in art history from Yale University. A curator, art historian, and professor, Martin began working with the New York-based Dia Art Foundation in 2015 and was appointed deputy director and chief curator in 2017. Previously, she was an assistant professor at Brown University and Vanderbilt University, a chancellor's postdoctoral fellow in the history of art at the University of California, Berkeley, a fellow at Getty Research Institute, and a Henry Moore Institute research fellow. She also worked in the Media, Arts, and Culture unit of the Ford Foundation in New York. In 2015, she received an Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant. And finally, Legacy Russell is a curator and writer. Born and raised in New York City, she is the associate curator of exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Russell held an MRES with distinction in art history from Goldsmiths University of London with a focus in visual culture. Her academic, curatorial, and creative work focuses on gender, performance, digital selfdom, internet idolatry, and new media ritual. Russell's written work, interviews, and essays have been published internationally. She is a recipient of the Toma Foundation 2019 Arts Writing Award in Digital Art and a 2020 Rauschenberg Residency Fellow and a 2021 Creative Capital grantee. Her first book, Glitch Feminism, a Manifesto, is published by Verso Books. So that was a lot to get through because you are so incredibly well-rounded and awarded, and it's just really a privilege to be in conversation with you this evening. So thank you for joining us. The first question I'd like to open up actually with Howardina. And so Howardina, thinking about your curatorial resume, it can be read as a who's who of modern art. And I'm wondering if you can share some insights about your time working at MoMA and how exhibition making influenced your practice.
All right, learning from my curatorial, can you hear me because I have two masks on?
You're fine.
Can you hear me? Okay. Learning from my curatorial experience was a heads up in terms of worrying about my legacy issues and my studio practice. I became very aware of conservation issues and the longevity of materials. I saw how works on paper deteriorated over time. If the paper was not 100% rag, it would deteriorate. I saw how oil on the skin left yellow stains on paper. I realized that video and film can deteriorate in about 20 years. One needs to transfer it to a new technologies as new technologies evolve. One needs to avoid hanging work where it gets direct sunlight or even over a working fireplace. The new ways of working may have their limitations. You can actually call a museum and ask for the conservation department. Tell them you are an artist and what your concerns are. Years ago, they welcomed the call. It is worth trying. If you go to a conservator to have a piece repaired, it's very pricey. There now is a wide range of work that answers that the answers to conservation problems are evolving with the flow. Some work is ephemeral and involves performance. One needs to document it, and yet some artists do not want to document their work. Working at MoMA mainly exposed me to white male artists. One African-American artist, Romery Bearden, was hung outside the collection in the hall. This was in the 1960s and 70s. Recently, Ann Temkin became chief curator and totally integrated the MoMA collection, hanging African-American male and female artists with white male and female artists. Mel Edwards had about 5 pieces hung in the same room as sculptor, a white woman, Jackie Windsor. This was unheard of when I worked there. Back then, they had the buyers committee to address the inequities in the collection. It led to 2 shows. One was of Bearden's work and the other was of Richard Hunt's sculpture. After the 2 shows happened, things went back to normal. I served on the committee with Betty Blayton Taylor, an artist who ran the museum's Children's Art Carnival in Harlem. The head of the committee was a wealthy, young white man who, after the committee's work was done, committed suicide. We do not know if he was harassed or had his own problems. Just general suggestions for the artists, and this is from working inside the museum: document your work. Keep a list of your work with all the details, including title, date, materials, where it had been exhibited. Also, if sold, who was it that you sold it to, and their contact information. Photograph it before you lend it. So if there's a damage, you can prove that you did not do it. Some of the cameras on cell phones are excellent for general documentation. Museum quality photographs of your work need to be done professionally. Always have a document if you lend work. Be sure to list the name of the person borrowing it and note all the contact information, the amount if it is sold, the length of the loan, and make a note of the condition of the work. Both should sign and date it.
Thank you, Harmony. I think that information that you gave is really crucial for artists, especially emerging ones that are entering in the field and are starting to get their first institutional exhibitions. And one of the things that I talk about when I give tours of your show is how, you are such an institutional artist. And I mean that in the sense of you're thinking about the heritage of your work as you're making it. When we install the exhibition, each painting is hung up with a set of nails, and each of those holes are actually reinforced with archival material. And that's something that I think, most artists, I've had artists show up at things that I've organized with their work in garbage bags. Like, they're not necessarily thinking about the care and safety of their work, but I think the fact that they spent so much time dealing with artwork that was degraded or artwork that needed special care within the institution, it really does inform the way that you think about making work to this day. So thank you for sharing all of that information.
Sure.
And I want to open up a couple of questions to the group now. One of the reasons why this was such a special moment for me, not only have I taken inspiration from the work that all of you have done, but we all share this common thread of operating at the intersection of race and gender within the art world. And I wanted to talk about how that particular work, if it does mean anything within your practice, and how you found ways to push at the constraints of those silos.
Legacy, do you want to kick us? It looked like you were about to say something, so I didn't want to.
It's like on the edge of it, but I mean, it's just so exciting to be in the room with all of you. And thank you, Adize and Howardina, for making this space for us. I mean, I guess I loved hearing about, the kind of top tips, best practices, Howardina, because I think that speaks so deeply to some of the work, obviously, that is ongoing at City Museum as we begin working often with artists who are just beginning their journey, right? So with me, in terms of, thinking about this intersection between race and gender, it's something that I'm, sort of deeply embedded in terms of my ongoing research, and, very much so thinking about the ways in which institutional space, just as you said, can be quite alienating for Black artists. And so for me, I think, when I consider what it means, the intersection of race and gender, where we stand at that place where, female identified artists, where queer artists, where Black artists are entering into institutional spaces, it's about trying to enact a methodology that can make that space, secure and make them feel seen and heard within the practice of their work, but also as well within its maintenance, within the lessons that we teach about how they can continue to grow towards a sustainable career.
I want to echo that same thank you to Adize and Howardina for inviting us to be a part of that this conversation. I think just to piggyback up what Legacy was saying about care, I think, of course, yes, I think it's our primary responsibility to care for artists of color within these spaces. But I think as curators, honestly, I don't necessarily see it as a silo, as something to push against. Like, I honestly see it as from a position of power or a position of great honor, to be honest. I see it as, sure, I mean, the institutions are slow to, change their collections, change their exhibitions. I mean, those kinds of things. But I honestly think that while it's something that, we're still striving for on many in terms of equity, I do see it as a position that I'm honored to have, right? That I'm honored to be able to be this champion for artists that I'm excited about and are working at this intersection. So on one level, I do see it something as we're pushing against, but I also see it from a position of strength as well.
Yeah, I love that. Courtney, do you have anything to add to that question?
I have to say, it took me a long time to realize that apparently I was working on artists that were marginal, because I saw their work first and was attracted to it and inspired by it and interested in it. And it was only when I came into either, school or into institutions and was told that they didn't know them, that, that I was doing something different. And I have to say, I'm not belittling this in any way, but I was really surprised. It surprised me that they couldn't see the art first. And I think that is, it is an issue, I think, that we still have to work with and against in different ways. Because, most artists that I know are working and making and, trying to survive and have their work seen. And I think that it becomes, the institution that wants to, sort of put them in a very precise box. And I think that, in fact, that if you sit in between the institution and the artist, that you should be working to unleash the box, as opposed to trying to build that up again.
This is a more general question about the actual act of curating and exhibition making. And I think a lot of it is really based in storytelling and, using the artist's work as a jumping off point to enhancing a conversation about their work. And I'd love for you each to talk about the methodology that you use to extract a story from an artist's practice.
I feel like it's tricky to talk about, sort of formulaically. I mean, I guess with everyone's practice curatorially, there are always different entry points to how that works. And Adizay, I appreciated when you say that, sometimes artists will just show up with their work in a bag, right? That like actually part of the work is trying to, actively listen and participate in the ways in which artists guide us. And so for me, I think that there's not like as much of a set sort of methodology, because it changes. And that also is what is so exciting about this work and so necessary, I think, about the spaces that we engage with artists, collaborate with artists, is allowing for those spaces to always be dynamic and volatile and intersectional. And so for me, there have been a wide range of different parts of that process, allowing for phone calls at all different times of the day, like having moments where I've literally sat down and listened to music with artists because that's their primary touch point and they're kind of, answering to that as a first language, There have been times where, it has required, extensive travel where, I'm kind of going to the places where, that artist has spent time and, where that kind of root lies, and beginning to get a better sense and understanding of the context around the work, so as to speak to it, represent it, celebrate it, write about it, right? So the methodology is this elastic thing, and that for me is something that I really try to maintain within my work with artists, and as well too to encourage, because I think it then allows for different types of transformations as we make exhibitions.
I totally agree. I think I, try and start by, of course, doing as much research as I can, doing as much reading as I can about the artist practice. But I also allow myself to be surprised. And I really do kind of walk in those initial visits with kind of an open mind and just to say, what do you think about this? Or can you tell me about this? Or recognizing, especially for artists that have been working for a long time, that they may not have had as much control of how their work was discussed early on in their career. And so oftentimes, and this is even actually how I lead even studio visits or even conversations now, where I come from a perspective of like, not that I don't know anything about your work, of course, but just an openness to learning or to understanding the work in a different way, right? Because I don't want to assume because I read this catalog from 20 years ago that that's how you think about the work today, right? So I definitely try and approach, I think, learning about the artist practice through a series of conversations, through a series of, like as he was saying, all times of the day, whether it's music, whether it's going out to dinner, all kinds of different ways. But I do try and kind of approach it with a sense of openness and a sense of, I'm coming in prepared, but I'm also ready to learn.
Just going to add that one of the best things I ever learned about an artist, I learned from Howardina, which is that I did an MA at Stony Brook. While Howardina, obviously she was esteemed faculty, but on the studio side. And I happened to once go to a crit that she was running with MFA students. Watching Howardina teach was one of the most instructive things I've ever seen in my entire life. There was a way in which she approached that situation with such generosity, but also structure. And, it felt as if she were guiding that student, towards real knowledge about their work, but there was a light touch. And it dawned on me that I had never taken that, watching how someone interacts with other artists to be, a research focus. And thank you, Howardina, because that was actually a real breakthrough in sort of understanding fully. It taught me perhaps a way to go back and look at your work after I saw you in process.
Thank you.
That was a really lovely sentiment. I appreciate you sharing that story, Courtney. I'd like to talk a little bit about institutional history, because I think, the Studio Museum in Harlem is such an important institution for me. It was, the first place where I had a real museum internship that turned into a job, that turned into a fellowship that I was able to do. There's such a history and legacy of curators who are working in the field now that kind of cut their teeth at the studio. And it's really is seen as this incubator space. And I'd love, Naima, since you were at the Studio Museum for a while and our time overlapped, and then Legacy, you're currently in that space, and Howardina, you've had exhibitions there. I think that it is just a really formative institution, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about some of the learnings that you had there and how that kind of shaped and informed your practice.
I feel like I can go on, and I think, like all of us, I think, have a deep connection to studio in so many different ways, right? Like, even if you didn't work there necessarily, like in Courtney's case, she's written for catalogs, there's so many different, and we owe, I think, so many parts of our career and so many parts of ourselves as curators to the Studio Museum. But I will say, so I joined the team.
Hold on a second, Naima. I did work at the Studio Museum too.
You did?
Yeah. I was a research associate for Valerie Mercer at a date that I won't name, but.
Well, since we are all have deep connections to studio, so I apologize, Courtney. I actually did not know that. So lesson learned. But I joined the Studio Museum in 2011, already being well versed in the history and importance of the institution. My great aunt actually was a very early board member of the museum. And so she'd been bringing us to the museum, and including my mom, for many, many years. And so when I joined the team, I was very aware of not just the importance, I think, that the museum plays within African-American art, but just globally, right? The larger global conversation around artists of color. And so I was honored to join a team with, Thomas Lax and Lauren Haynes, from 2011 to 2015 is when I was there. And I would say, like I said, I can really think of a million different stories, and Thelma's probably gonna kill me for sharing this one, but I remember, pitching my, what I originally wanted to be was a retrospective of Charles Gaines's work. When I joined the team, I was like, I know exactly what I want to do. I really want to do Charles Gaines's retrospective. And, Thelma in her way, and Legacy will probably chuckle at this, but Thelma in her way didn't say no. She was just kind of like, it was more like a not yet, which I took as encouragement. So I just kept pitching it. Like I just kept, and not to say she didn't believe it. Of course, she believes in Charles's work and recognizes the significance of doing it. But I think also recognizing maybe I wasn't ready as a little junior whopper, to take on that level of exhibition. And so I just kept pitching it. And so we just would engage a number of conversations about timing for artists and what role the Studio Museum plays in an artist's career. And so she really encouraged me to think very specifically about an aspect of Charles's practice rather than the entire retrospective, because she said, you know what, Charles deserves a retrospective at MoMA. He deserves a retrospective at the Whitney or LACMA. And he does. And so we talked, and not to say again that Studio Museum doesn't occupy that space, but the idea that, I still count myself as a Studio Museum person, but if we did the retrospective, that would mean that it would kind of let other institutions off the hook from having to do it sooner, right? So if I just focus, which I end up doing, on 74 to 89, that would then say, give an institution kind of like, oh, it's been done, and they can kind of check it off their list, rather than saying like, oh, an aspect of his career. And so, now we kind of see the early work, but really another institution should really take on that responsibility because he deserves it. And so I think it was just a pivotal, one of the many life lessons I learned in thinking about what's best for an artist, right? That you may have your own kind of like goals and desires and hopes and dreams, in terms of exhibitions, but really thinking about what's best for the artist, what really fits with an institution, and what will best serve, an artist long term. I think is just kind of and just kind of recognizing that while studio is larger than life in terms of institution, it does serve a very specific role in terms of advancing, an artist's career, kind of opening up a different perspective, allowing people to think about an artist practice differently, which are all great, but it still does not necessarily relieve other institutions from doing that work too.
Legacy, I wanted to throw a question at you since you're operating within the institution right now. And I'm thinking about how change has occurred in the space. When I was there, we were just, and I still use the institutional we too. It's something that I've been at the Shed almost 3 years, but I'm still we at the Studio Museum. But I think one of the things that I'm interested in, especially coming to the Shed, where when I got hired, we were still having the building under construction, and thinking about how you can program a space that doesn't exist yet and using your imagination in that way, and asking artists to really trust you and give, Howardina was engaged in 2017 by the Shed at first. And so what does it mean to build a level of trust with an artist when you're talking about a space that isn't necessarily the traditional space? I'm thinking about all of the wonderful works that you do with the Parks Project, but also when you're talking about a space that right now is in the abstract.
I mean, absolutely. I think we all, first of all, the we of it in terms of talking about Studio Museum still and having that be possible, I think speaks to the history. It's deeply intersectional and embedded, and, people are still living in it, even if they have gone on to other places. And so, at this moment, we've had these amazing kind of, really complex discussions about how to do this work, kind of through and beyond this present moment, and recognizing, of course, that while people may be new to our mission, right, kind of waking up newly to it, that our mission-driven work isn't new. And so some of the discussions that we've been having right now are recognizing that arc is, really long, that it goes back to, our founding in the 1960s and, brings us present, but as well predates 1968, right, when the museum first opened. And, I think for me, Naima, I so appreciated when you speak to your early memories of Studio Museum, because, as a born and raised New Yorker whose dad was from Harlem, this was a place, my dad was a photographer, right? So, talk about where people have their shows. This is the place that was part of my, father's kind of creative imagination always. And so we spent so much time kind of thinking about, as we visited family in Harlem as well, like what it meant to be in that space. And so, with this idea of this moment of change, Adize, it's this incredible period because like Blackness itself, right? Harlem is both very specific and it's also ontological. It's local and global. And so I think we've had to really step into that kind of elasticity and try to navigate what it means to be without walls. And so that, of course, has taken all these different forms. We've got, this amazing traveling exhibition, Black Refractions, which allows, even to its title, right? Allows for the kind of refractions of Blackness to exist in the world. And, currently it just opened in Utah and is just phenomenal and has had these different lives in this period, and allowed Studio Museum almost to kind of expand and kind of take over in the United States. And then, we of course are in close partnership with MoMA and MoMA PS1, and I love the discussion about, the sort of presence of these different spaces and institutions as their histories have collided, and the work that Studio Museum has done to kind of, expand and really push further some of our mission as it exists out in the world. So, it's been really phenomenal to see Garrett Bradley, at MoMA, or, as well recognizing E. Jane and Nadine Pierre and Elliot Reed at MoMA PS1. And so for this reason, there's this kind of incredible dispersion of our mission. And so, it's been this period of time of trying to navigate what it means to kind of exist in both, the present and the future, and as well honor our past, and to make it possible to have, the kind of mission be embedded in the ambassadorship of the institution too. And this is where we go back to the we, because, I see that so deeply, obviously, with all the folks who are in this room, but as well too, that, in this moment where we are without walls, where we're planning towards this next chapter of the museum, and we're going to have this incredible building, designed by David Adjaye, that, we're kind of looking towards this future where not only Studio Museum will continue to exist in Harlem and expand, and kind of dazzle in that way in terms of honoring this incredible history, but also as well looking out into the world and really being able to see Studio Museum and each of the institutions, not only that each of you are in presently, right, but as well, so many of our esteemed colleagues.
Thank you. I'm going to jump back to Howardina really quickly. And I wanted to talk about the research that you did in the 80s, and then you continued to do, and you just emailed me about something related to these recent appointments. So I know that you're still thinking about this, where you conducted this research about the state of the art world, and you used empirical data and a statistical approach to kind of confront what's going on in the industry in the 80s. Honestly, it's still happening today along racial lines, and the disparities between appointments and between who is getting exhibitions. And something that I was really struck by, that I want to quote you here, is we must evolve a new language which empowers us and does not cause us to participate in our own disenfranchisement. And I think that you said that in, I have the text here. It's The Heart of the Question, and it's a series of your writings that you thought through in this text that is a collection of it. But I'm thinking about 40 years later, what are some of the positive change? I'm always looking, especially in this moment, I find myself trying to find positivity. And I think we've gone through a year that's kind of been mired in stress and trauma in a lot of ways. And I'm constantly trying to find the positive. We tried to do that with this exhibition too. We were talking about really heavy subject matter, but then we tried to find ways of imbuing the space with beauty. And you do that so seamlessly in your practice. And I'd love for you to talk about some of the positive changes that you've seen in the field.
Okay, as mentioned earlier, Ann Temkin, the chief curator of painting and sculpture at the Modern, has moved the collection forward to include artists of color and women. This is an amazing change. Unfortunately, COVID sort of not put a stop, but there's a pause. I feel that some of the changes that are evolving have to do with the death of George Floyd. Suddenly, out of the shadows, whites and African Americans were protesting together, and the protest went around the world. First Nation people joined the protest, but the press overlooked covering them. A friend, First Nation Lakota, sent me a video of the protest. In terms of language, I feel that my own vocabulary is evolving, mainly because I'm becoming more aware. The person who helped me to gain my voice was First Nation Matinecock artist and educator Siva Tubahachi. Her website is spiritofjanuary.com. She mainly explores issues of oppression. In looking into the past, I have had white male critics call my work shrill if it dealt with issues. One white critic actually said my work was a light show and that he wanted to have sex under my paintings. That makes me laugh, but anyway, I do not know if they could have gotten away with that now. One was a reviewer for the New York Times and the other was a reviewer for the New Art Examiner. Dealing with issues helps to refuel my own use of statistics to review and reveal the art world's lack of diversity and insensitivity. My father's degree was in mathematics and science, so I was exposed to the use of statistics when I was a child. Statistics became my language of revealing the truth of the true nature of the art world's closed system. Art in America published a late summer issue that listed galleries as well as listed artists the gallery said in print they represented. Things have changed as the Jack Sheneman Gallery represents over 13 African and African American artists. The gallery is here in New York City. If you go to the gallery's website, you can see their work. I am looking forward to Asians being brought forward. I'm also concerned about First Nation artists. My gallery, the Garth Brennan Gallery, has 8 First Nation artists. Antoine Sargent is now one of the directors for the Gagosian Gallery. Things are definitely changing with Ann Temkin again, being a leader to help major museums change their attitude or point of view.
Thank you, Howardina. Courtney, I want to turn to you for a little bit because I'm thinking about recent appointments, and Howardina mentioned a few of them, but to me, I think that it's an exciting moment, and I think all of these new appointments, especially those that are not just in entry or mid-level, but actually directorships and at the chief level, are really important. And I'm curious to know what your perspective is about how we can sustain change that's not just a reactionary conversation, but something that will really shift the industry. And that's a big question, I know.
It is a big question. And it's a big challenge, I think, actually. You know, I think the first thing that we have to do is assume that those appointments were not reactionary. Like, what would they be reacting to exactly? Because I don't know a single person who's been appointed to what I would call a big job. You know, I look at Naima, you know, people who have gotten big jobs recently, and I think to myself, I know the path that a lot of those wonderful people have taken to get there. And, you know, in many cases, I would say, well, finally. As opposed to how did that happen? And I think that, you know, there perhaps are, you know, there's a parallel conversation going on, and maybe instead of a parallel conversation, we need to have a single conversation about it. But I would say something that I think I've said before, which is that, you know, if you are already in a position of power, no matter who you are, if you take the moment to actually speak to someone else that is not just like you and mentor that person, there could be real change. I don't think that takes a lot, actually, and I don't think that it is. You know, this isn't a big ask. And the way that these jobs, you know, these are big jobs that are happening to important people. Though that is not a big ask to reach down and work with someone. You know, I look at the moment, you know, in my own career where people have, you know, just said hi and spoken to me and like given me some sort of piece of that. And I think that there's actually real value in that. You know, early conversations with Howardina when I was still just trying to figure out what it meant to be an art historian were important conversations to me. Likely they, you know, were throwaway conversations for her. But, you know, being able to talk to somebody who had had such a pivotal role at MoMA at such an incredible moment meant so much. And I learned so much even just from the example that I think that if we all, you know, took the time to do that, but I think in fact it is even more important for those of us who don't necessarily feel connected to a specific group to do that work.
Courtney, if I'm allowed, sorry, Adize, am I allowed to ask questions? Okay. I think I agree. I think, you know, simply, you know, mentoring someone else, especially someone that doesn't look like you or, you know, someone who's a bit more junior is very important. And I think could certainly lead to growth on both ends, right? Growth for you as the mentor and then growth for the mentee. But we're being called upon to do so much more than that, right? Like we're being called upon to enter into conversations that either we don't have the training for or we're not prepared to enter into. And so, you know, just to piggyback off of Adize's questions, especially as a director, how are you navigating that where you're kind of, you know, being asked, I'm going to assume that you're being asked to engage in very high level, bigger conversations that go beyond kind of a mentorship role.
You're right. And that does happen. And I think, you know, when we've talked about this very, very briefly, but, you know, it's not my job alone. And there is a long conversation about the work that somebody who looks like me and sounds like me and acts like me is expected to do versus what other people are expected to do. And I think, you know, as I tell, and this, you know, this is a real message that I want to impart is that, you know, when I look out at my peer directors, this is as much your work as it is anybody else's. You know, this is not something that we can all sort of sit around and fret and make, sort of very superficial statements about. You actually have to do that work. But at the same time, I am not going to I'm not going to pretend that we are past the superficial space at this point either in doing that work. And I think this is, there is a way in which, I think all of our phones started to ring, in July. But I already had a job to do. And so I think everyone has to be very clear about, where they stand and what they're willing to do, but also not be scared about putting that work out for others. This is, if you want to talk about collaboration, this is collaboration at this point.
Mhm.
I think it's really a crucial thing to consider when we're discussing what it means to actually enact institutional change, because it's one thing to acquire new work and it's one thing to do a show every 5 years, but it's another thing to have people working across all different levels within your institution. It's another thing to have different people sitting on your board. And so it really is work that needs to be done. And it's not I think you're 100% correct that it's not work that can be done alone, and it shouldn't be resting on the shoulders of one person. And it can sometimes feel like that when you're in these different institutions.
Adizay, I love that you're talking about the kind of collective work there, because I was going to say too that, being very much aware of what it means to exist within an institution that has visionary leadership, right? It's touched us all, as we've already said, but also recognizing that part of the work, I think, of, the kind of leaders that I turn to and have continued to be really inspired by and mentored by are folks who are also willing, as Courtney, you're saying too, like not to shoulder that alone, right? To kind of open up the process, to allow things to perhaps be at points more participatory, and to engage the body of the institution, to be equally responsible for some of that work, as well as, the work that kind of happens at a leadership level. And so, Adizay, I felt like really amazed and, excited as well to see moments across different institutions where, the folks at, different department levels across, kind of surprising intersections of solidarity and those expressions kind of continue to do that work, right? That kind of allyship work, that advocacy work, but also like the kind of like deep tissue work of what it means to reshape a vision of an institution, which really does have to be something that kind of happens, not necessarily at the leadership level alone, but rather, across the different striations of an institutional space.
And just to say, in terms of collective work, I mean, also just not, to encourage our colleagues to not burden artists with that work either, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
I can only imagine if our phones are ringing that, artists were called upon, in many different ways, whether or not it's exhibitions, public programs, speaking engagements, come talk to my board. I mean, all those kinds of requests, to help, institutions appear as if they are doing this work, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's just as much, obviously, responsibility on us as I'm sure double, on artists to respond in this moment.
And I think that's a really great segue into this next question that I have, which we were talking a little bit more broader strokes, and I want to get a little bit more specific in terms of the work that we do. And I'm really curious about what you consider the responsibilities of curating Black art to be. And I know that to me, it feels very specific, but I can see how it could be a little bit broad. But I do want to talk about that, because I think that while the reality is that people are entering into these spaces, there does need to be a level of care and consideration for all artists, yes. But I do think that, when you're bringing someone into a space that could be harmful to them, as a curator, what are some of the things that you think are really imperatives for you as you're organizing these shows?
I mean, I was talking to a dear friend and colleague and amazing curator recently, who, we were kind of going back and forth about the various politics of AV, right? Like literally like audiovisual, kind of production within the context of hosting Black artists and specific and intersection with, work that I'm deeply invested in, which is kind of live work, like performance work, new media work, work that engages technologies. And so, this is something that I feel is really important because I feel like AV sometimes is kind of the unsung hero within some of the institutional practices of doing this work. And I loved, Howardina, when you mentioned like how technologies turn over even, right? Being aware of that and doing the kind of mindful work to best support Black artists who are working with different types of technologies as they're coming into institutional space, and being mindful that, how that works and the language around it often, comes with many tripwires and can be a very vulnerable process. And I also, recognize too that there are so many parts of curating that require care. So like, thinking about, who is copy editing texts, as well as, who's kind of doing some of this programmatic work and what are the conversations we're doing to actively bring the artist into the center of that, right? Not to necessarily tax them with additional labor, right? But to make sure that what we are kind of engaging with and the questions that we're asking are not alienating the artist who should see themselves in this work. So, this is a kind of complicated thing too, because, institutional spaces can be really triggering. And they can be very challenging, but they also are amazing spaces, I think, that, offer so much in terms of, allowing for a different type of collaboration and setting a different kind of standard or bar for the ways in which we can kind of bring Black art and artists into institutional spaces and have, folks really feel like that these spaces are theirs. And so for me, thinking back to my, early times of, going to the Studio Museum, being able to see yourself, in the actual kind of architecture of the space, being able to really understand the history, and as well intersect with the creative program there is really meaningful because it really is a reminder that nothing within these spaces is neutral, and the ways in which, we are kind of doing some of that work actively allows for, that sort of assumption of neutrality, which I think can be problematic within institutional settings, like who is that for and kind of how do we define that, to be disrupted and to allow for, Black art and artists to, have a different type of space held for them, to feel like they have, a sense of, ownership over the exhibitions that are theirs, really.
I mean, I think, a bit about what I shared a little bit earlier in terms of the story with Charles is just to say that, thinking in terms of care for Black artists, just thinking about, producing exhibitions that they're going to advance their practice, advance their work in some way, the scholarship on their work, showing a new perspective, but also thinking about, or just being mindful that I'm giving a lot of attention to the actual work, right? And not, allowing oftentimes the kind of more superficial readings, I think, to what Courtney was saying, and just really being astute to the work itself and being a student of that work. And so, you start with this communication and you're starting with this dialogue, right, with an artist, and then, just kind of understanding, why do they produce the work? How do they produce the work? I mean, all these kinds of questions to really, pay as much attention to the work and the care that went into producing the work as possible.
Well, we are actually coming up much faster than I anticipated on our time. And so I wanted to ask just one final question. And this is something that I like to ask when I'm thinking and talking to people who have been in the field longer than I have been, but also in general. Something that I'm curious about is what you think would be helpful preparation for the next generation of art historians, because Naima, you mentioned, and it's something that I'm constantly thinking about because I feel like I'm finally at a place where I'm in the next jump in my career, and I'm very much looking forward to talking to people and bringing people into the field where they might have felt alienated or felt like this wasn't something that they could do. And so I'm curious, what is some advice that you all have for the next generation of art historians, the next generation of caretakers of artwork and artists? What's something that you'd like to impart to them?
an idea, just if I ever went back to being a curator, but at 77, that's not likely. But an idea I had, and it came out of working on an interview with Valerie Maynard for her show. They asked me to interview her for the catalog, so the Artist Awards would be there. And I kept thinking, it would be wonderful if I were back in the museum. Again, I'm too old. To have something I call lifelong oral history. So that as artists of color come into the collection, they are interviewed and then re-interviewed every 10 years to update us on their work and what's happening in their life, and just to continue the thread all the way until the end. That would be an amazing resource for art historians and for other artists. But you would need to be in an institution that either maybe had a library or had space for an archive to build that kind of information. And of course, technology is tricky, because if you interview them with one kind of technology, then by the 10-year period, a new technology has taken over, and maybe there's no real mechanical support for the early ones. So it's kind of complex. But it's just just an idea I had as an artist, to know that every so many years I'd be interviewed, and so people would know the kind of whole thread of my work.
I love that idea. I actually, in preparation for this show very early on, I went to MoMA because they have the Skowhegan archives, and I listened to a lecture that you gave at Skowhegan, and I had to listen to it on a Discman. And I think the last time I saw a Discman, I was in middle school. So it was just like that idea of, technology becoming antiquated, but still figuring out a way to use it. It is a resource, but I think one thing that's important to note about it is, I knew about it because I worked at MoMA, and I knew how to get access to that archive after I had left, because I had maintained connections with people who worked in the library. But for younger scholars who maybe don't have those resources, I think, yes, it should be tied to an institution, because I think that the care should come from a space that will be able to continue to have the resources to take care of it. But making sure that it's an equitable pursuit for everyone is an important thing. So yes, I love that idea. I hope that it happens. But I do want it to be something that everyone can take part in and listen to and be exalted by. So.
Yeah, I guess, Howardina, actually, I went back to Amazing Catalog of Odyssey.
Oh my God.
Yes, which was your exhibition at the City Museum in 1986, I believe. But and there was a quote that you kind of was folded into the essay there that said, as a Black artist, you were not seen as an artist first, but a political entity. And I was just kind of turning that over, because at the same time, I've been going back and reading some of the late and great Maurice Berger's writing, and thinking very much so about some of what was written. I think there was a Art in America in the 90s where he was kind of talking about what it needs to happen for this next generation as well, right? Of sort of Black art in institutional spaces. And it felt like, of course, that it really echoes all that we're talking about here, in addition to everything that's going on in the world. And of course, that was, some time ago. So, with that in mind, I was kind of intrigued by the fact that Maurice Berger puts forward this proposition that, a kind of relinquishment of white privilege was required in order for, a presence of Blackness within institutions, that actually was a part of the negotiation. And I was kind of turning it over because, of course, too, I feel like that while that may be one spoke within this larger wheel, there also is something that feels really important about, what it means to kind of ensure that Black people are able to see themselves within this work, right? Within this work intergenerationally, within the kind of intersections across artist and curator, being able to have those conversations and have that kind of institutional memory, but also, the way that that discourse can operate, across a community. And so I feel very much so that that happens, across a plane of mentorship. But, as well too, Adizay, I was appreciating your discussion on social media earlier, where you kind of mentioned this language of liberation, and that there feels like, so much of a moment now where the possibility of, museum space and its future can be emancipatory and can work towards liberation work. And that, kind of having those threads deeply embedded within what this next step could look like. And, I do feel that we're seeing it all around us, right? That these are things that are becoming part of the muscle of what institutions in this new chapter of, the future of art should look like, is responsible for. So for this next generation of art historians, my hope is that, that is going to be part of the language of this work. And as well that, that is what will keep things kind of, opening up, blossoming, becoming kind of more amplified in terms of presence, but also transparency and collaboration.
I would also say, I think Legacy put it perfectly, but just to say that for younger art historians, especially of color, is that, you're a part of a network, that you're entering into a longer legacy. And please do not be shy to reach out to folks who you think may be out of reach, because we've all been there, and and we want to support one another. I mean, just hearing Courtney talk about the importance of mentorship, I think is something that we all recognize as being very important. So just to say that, there may not be a lot of us, in comparison to other ethnicities, I do think that it's a very rich legacy in history. And it's just to say that, reach out to colleagues and, understand that you're a part of a much bigger network of people that are here to support you and are here to help galvanize your work and to help give you that voice, whether or not it's, allowing you to write for a catalog or, being a part of a larger, panel discussion, whatever it is. It's just to say that, it may feel isolating at times because in some of these institutions, you may be the only one, or in some of these grad programs, you may be, one of few, but just to say that you are entering a very rich network that is here to support you. And you should totally utilize that network.
I wanted to make a suggestion. When I first joined MoMA, the curators went directly to artist studios. The galleries were not a middle person. And now it's like the galleries are determining who will be collected. The artists are not necessarily being visited in their studio. So I would really encourage people to not depend solely on the galleries. Because there are a number, especially the younger folks that are coming out now that we don't know anything about. I also suggest that people go and visit the residency program at the Studio Museum in Harlem. I did that when they were having an open house, and I try to donate to that residency program, being, shall we say, an elder artist and having enough sales that I can donate. So I'd like to encourage everyone to try to get into the artist studios, not necessarily depending on art galleries, to have access to the work.
Well, Howardina, your visit to the studios last year was like, or I guess it was 2019 actually, but it's like legendary visit just because it was so special to see, the cohort of artists, of this current moment, right? Being able to, of course, see the ongoing successes of your work, right? And see as well that career is a long and, ecstatic arc. So I so appreciate that too, because I really agree that, it's a special experience being able to go into artist studios. And in this moment, of course, I've been doing lots of studio visits via Zoom, but I look forward to the moments where we're able to do some of that more active convening and safely so, because it is a really important part of kind of developing, Adize, back to, kind of your early question, that methodology.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that the only thing that I would really advise anyone to do if they are interested in art and artist is to actually look at art and artist. Living artists are available. Howardina, straight from the mouth of an artist. But in terms of, if you study historical periods of art, let go of some of the theory and look at the art. Because I think that is in the same way that, it's interesting to hear Howardina say that, don't let the dealer be in the way, don't let the theory be in the way either. Because the work itself speaks across time if you're willing to listen to it.
I I think that that is a perfect note to end on. I am so, so appreciative of all of your time and all of your thoughts for this panel. It's always great to be in communion with colleagues, but especially those who I've had relationships with for quite a long time. And it just feels very reifying to me to even be able to moderate this. So I'm really, really appreciative of all of your time. Thank you, Howardina. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Legacy. Thank you, Naima. And then I have to do, as we're closing out, some housekeeping. So I'd love to, again, say thank you to the Howard Gilman Foundation for providing the Zoom video platform for tonight's conversation, as well as the Ford Foundation and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for their support of both the exhibition and our public programs. And I'd like to say thank you to all of the supporters, including Howardina's Galleries, but also thank you again to our panelists for being so willing to come and speak with us this evening. And thank you to the civic programs and IT teams for helping to put together this event and have it run fairly smoothly. I also have to just plug, we have a catalog for the exhibition and it just arrived stateside this week. It was a moment with COVID and shipping and everything, but it's here. It's beautiful. It's very, very worth spending some time with. Howardina has an incredible series of writings. There's an interview with Ashley James, and it's just a really beautiful text. And I'm so grateful that it's in the world. So I hope that you can spend some time with it. And the show is open. If you can go to the shed safely, I encourage you to spend some time with the works in person. And I really appreciate everyone's time this evening. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Adize. Thank you, Howardina.
Thank you,
thank
Howardina and Adize.
Oh,
Thank
thank
you so much.
Such a pleasure.